There's one quote about hope that I love so much. It's by Professor David Orr, and he says, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. So how do I stay hopeful? I just keep rolling up my sleeves. And if I don't roll up my sleeves and get to work and find other people who are wonderful and solutionary focused and want to do this work too, it's easy to fall into some despair, right? If you're not seeing positive changes that you are part of, it's easy to lose that hope.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season includes 25 incredible episodes devoted to the inner development goals. Based on the science of personal transformation, the IDG framework represents 23 skills needed for today's world. And of course, empathy is one of them. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show.
Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. This season is devoted to the Inner Development Goals Framework, the IDGs, and I am so excited to have a conversation about optimism with Zoe Weil, who is the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education. She has written 8 books and speaks widely about how to build a healthy, just, and humane future. Her latest book is The Solutionary Way: Transform Your Life, Your Community, and the World for the Better. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Especially since it includes a foreword from Jane Goodall, who is, an angel walking on the planet. That's so exciting. The book, I know, offers a path away from polarization, oh my gosh, and toward collaborative systems change. Zoe created the first graduate programs in humane education, linking human rights, environmental sustainability, and animal protection, offered online through a partnership with Antioch University. And in 2023, so last year, she was the recipient of the Spirit of America Award, and her portrait was painted for the Americans Who Tell the Truth series. Congratulations and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Anita. It is just a joy to speak to you again, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Well, I feel like this book is a culmination of your life's work. Right? I feel like, you've done so much in your career. I mean, you are truly committed to the cause of humane education. And this book that is spilled out of you is sort of a culmination. It's like the masterpiece of everything that, congratulations. Before we get into the book, for those who may not know our conversation from a couple of years ago, I'd love to just revisit what brought you to this moment in time. Could you tell us a little bit of the plot twists and turns in your life that brings you to the work that you do and what calls you to this commitment?
Sure. So, at the risk of telling my whole life story, which we'd be on for a long time, I would say that there was this week in the summer of 1987 that let me have a glimpse into what my life's work could be and how powerful it could be. And I was in divinity school studying comparative world religions, looking for a summer job, found a program that was being offered at the University of Pennsylvania for middle school students. And I pitched a bunch of courses. So these were week-long courses. And these were humane education courses. One was on animal issues, one was on environmental issues, one I pitched was on media literacy issues. And in one of those courses, it was actually the second most popular of the 60 courses that were offered that summer, the one on animal issues. I talked about what we're doing to animals in our culture and how we could make different choices and help animals. And one boy went home that night and he made his own homemade leaflets. And this was in 1987. He hand wrote his leaflets. He did not have a personal computer. And he handed them out on a street corner the next day while the rest of us were having lunch because he learned about something and he wanted to create change. And the power of that, of learning about something and becoming the word I use now is solutionary. Becoming a solutionary overnight made me realize that if we could transform our education system and bring real world issues that kids cared about into the classroom, and that they could gain the skills to apply their academic knowledge to solving problems, they would feel empowered and excited. The education that they got would be enlivened. Teachers would be happy. Schools would be happy. Communities would thrive. Like, it could be this cascade of really great opportunities for change. So that was a really long time ago, but it led to the trajectory of my life's work in humane education, teaching about the interconnected issues of human rights, environmental sustainability, and animal protection, with this goal of educating young people to be solutionaries. And now, so I ended up co-founding the Institute for Humane Education, creating our grad programs. Now we work around the globe, and teachers are bringing solutionary focused learning into their classrooms from K to 12, also in college. And this is happening on 6 continents. We're doing this most deeply in the United States, but also in Canada and all over the world. And wherever we go, we see this incredible benefit to kids and schools and communities.
Tell me more about this benefit.
So I want to tell you about the benefit by telling you a story. I like stories because they can sometimes stick when the statistics and the data doesn't. So about a dozen years ago, so this is before the pandemic, this is before depression and anxiety among youth was reaching epidemic proportions, I was invited to speak to some middle school students at a school in Connecticut. And I asked the kids what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. And their responses filled a whiteboard. It was a big whiteboard. Same responses that adults say, even though they were not learning about these issues at school. They just knew about them. And remember, this is a dozen years ago. So then I asked the kids to raise their hands if they thought we could solve the problems that they listed on the whiteboard. And of the 45 kids in that classroom, only 5 raised their hands. Only 5 could even imagine that we could solve those problems. That was the most sobering moment in my decades of work as an educator. I thought, if they can't imagine solving the problems, what will motivate them to try? So I stopped what I was doing and I led them in a guided visualization in which I asked them to imagine that they were very old and approaching the end of a very long and well-lived life. And I had them picture themselves sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day, and the air was clean, the waterways were clean, the birds were singing. There hadn't been a war in as many years as they could remember. Nobody went to bed hungry. We'd learned to treat each other and other species with compassion and respect. And then I asked them to imagine a child coming up and joining them on the park bench. And the child had all sorts of questions about how things had changed for the better. And then the child asked a final question. What role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? What did you do? And while they still had their eyes closed during this visualization, I asked them to raise their hands if now they could imagine us solving the problems they'd listed on that whiteboard. And this time, 40 hands went up in the air. So it did not take long to restore their hope. What it took was thinking a better world is possible, visualizing it, and then knowing that they played a role in it. So fast forward a couple of years, I was speaking at a conference in Guadalajara, Mexico, and the day before the conference, I visited the school that was hosting the event. And when I got there, they said, "Hey, will you talk to our 5th graders?" And I was thinking about the 5th and 6th graders I'd talked to in Connecticut. So I asked the kids to raise their hands if they could imagine us solving the problems in the world. And every hand flew up in the air immediately. So what was different? What was different is that their teacher had been teaching them about problems, specifically environmental problems, and in age-appropriate ways. And they had been involved in solving them. They had installed solar panels at their school. They had a composting system. They were refilling their water bottles instead of using disposable plastics. They knew problems could be solved because they were learning to be solutionaries. So this is a long way of answering your question. What are the benefits? The benefits are that sense of evidence-based optimism because you've done good work and you've seen the impacts. The benefits are a sense of empowerment. The benefits are that you actually engage in making the world better, that you're not apathetic. You're not just spending your days scrolling on social media, and you are engaged in community with others who care, which is deeply meaningful, which sets you up for a deeply rewarding life at the same time as you're contributing to a better community and a better nation and a better world for others.
And when you're talking, what comes up for me, what I've noticed teaching undergrads for the last 10 years or so, is a subtle shift. There's been a lot of shifts. Mental health crisis, as you mentioned earlier, is more and more obvious to me, and a bunch of other things. But one thing I've known is that there's this slipping sense of agency, that kids don't feel like they have a sense of agency. And I wonder if you could speak to the role that agency plays, maybe that's a different word that you use, for a solutionary mindset.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This sense of agency, and I use that word too, is it's so important. And when we do solutionary work, so I'm just going to quickly define solutionary. So a solutionary is somebody who can identify unjust, unsustainable, and inhumane systems and transform them in ways that do the most good and the least harm for all people, for animals, and for the environment. So you can see embedded in that definition that there is this ethical foundation of doing the most good and the least harm. So a solutionary is not the same as a problem solver. You know, a engineer can solve the problem of damming a river or blowing up a mountaintop for coal removal, but they're not a solutionary because they don't have that ethical foundation. And when you have a solutionary mindset, you believe that problems are solvable. That's part of the mindset. Problems are solvable. You are less interested in choosing sides and being drawn into either or debates, and more interested in discovering the underlying problem and collaborating and understanding from different stakeholders what different needs are so that you can solve it. And that mindset leads to a sense of agency. When you are interested in talking to stakeholders in order to solve problems, you are already on that path to solving problems, and you are already cultivating that sense of agency.
And before we get into some of the skills of solutionaries, I want to actually take another stab at the word solutionary, because you have described systems that need to be changed or disrupted in a solutionary mindset, which is great, because I remember at one point coming across some work around heropreneurship, the idea that social entrepreneurs are these like heroes out changing the world. And then there's a woman at Oxford who came up with a tool called the Impact Gaps Canvas, which looks at the gaps in systems, and we have to look at problems within a systemic sort of systems thinking mindset. When I hear the word solutionary, it sounds almost like it's very catchy for sure. I love it. And I think solution, like there, check box. But we know that from systems thinking, if we, attack one thing, then some other things start to unfold. So I'm glad that systems is embedded in the definition of solutionary. Could you maybe say a little bit more about that?
Totally. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because one of the key features of a solutionary solution is it has the fewest unintended negative consequences. And so we talked about a little bit about the solutionary mindset. There's also solutionary thinking. So solutionary thinking is comprised of many kinds of thinking, but primarily four: critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking. And these are not sequential, right? You don't just think critically in this moment, and then you think creatively in this moment. However, critical thinking is foundational to the other kinds of thinking. That if we can't determine what's factual from what's not factual, or what's opinion from fact, if we can't assess bias and really understand what is true and what is not true, then we're not going to be able to apply systems thinking effectively, because we won't be grounded in that. But then we need to understand that all these systems interconnect, and anytime we pull at any piece, we're going to have an impact elsewhere. And that is why it's so important to look for the causes of problems, like deeply look at the root causes, the mindsets, the beliefs, the worldviews, and the systemic causes. We create these systems out of our mindsets and beliefs, and then we have these intricate systems. And when we are trying to solve a problem, well, we could look at trying to change the mindsets, very hard to do. We could look at trying to change a system, but if we change a system, what are going to be all of the impacts of that? And so this is where we really need to have done our research. So in the solutionary framework, you go through these 4 phases of identifying the problem that you want to solve really carefully, and then investigating it thoroughly, and only then innovating a solution, and then implementing the solution. But the implementation also includes iterating, analyzing, assessing, were there unintended negative consequences? How can I improve on it? So in that process of innovating a solution, that's where we really want our strategic thinking, because we're going to have to be thinking, what are going to be all of the systemic impacts from this? And of course, we bring our creativity to that whole process. So it's very challenging in a globalized world where everything is connected to be able to see all these. And that's why, while solutionary as a word, for many people, it's like, oh, I love that word. I want to be one of them. And the reason I had to write this whole book is because it's not as simple as just wanting to be a solutionary. It's a practice that takes a lot of honing. And so that's what the framework is all about. It's giving people very specific tools to be successful solutionaries.
And that's why people need to read the book, because we need more solutionaries in the world. We need to clone solutionaries. And they're not problem solvers. They're not activists or humanitarians, right? So you really see those as distinct, right? How are they different from being an activist or humanitarian, just out of curiosity?
So I would say the way I describe it in my book is that it takes activism to the next level. It takes humanitarianism to the next level. It's not that activists and humanitarians can't be solutionaries. It's that they're honing their work. So, what's a humanitarian? Somebody who's trying to alleviate suffering or mitigate harm. Not somebody who is trying to address the cause of that suffering and harm and prevent it from continuing. So a solutionary, we need humanitarians, of course we do. But if we only have humanitarians, the problems persist. We're not actually solving the problem. So that's why I say solutionaries take humanitarianism to the next level. And activists, many solutionaries would probably identify as activists. You can be a solutionary inventor, though, never identifies as an activist, but you've invented something that's such an incredible innovation that it's going to solve a lot of problems. I think a lot of people, when they hear the word activist, they think of somebody at a protest or a rally or doing civil disobedience. And those actions can be quite profound and extremely important for creating change, but not always. Sometimes it backfires. Sometimes the anger that activists feel, and I include myself among the people who struggle with this, the anger that drove you to go to that protest and do that civil disobedience, if you're not careful about doing the inner work and the inner development goals, if you're not careful about doing that, then there's the potential that anger just, spews out into the world, and you are actually counterproductive to your own goals because you're turning so many people off. So that's the challenge. And solutionary work, it helps us get to just another level of strategy and success.
And I imagine another manifestation of that is if it's not channeled towards solutionary, a solutionary approach could actually live in your body and cause all sorts of, trauma and dysfunction, right? There's so much to look out at the world and feel horrified by, and then just be paralyzed with overwhelm. So this is yet another opportunity to work through that by leaning into solutionary. You mentioned the IDG, so let me just ask, because I feel like the Solutionary Way seems like it was designed to promote the inner development goals, or that there's a lot of overlap. So I'd like to maybe hear what you have to say about seeing the framework for the first time and what you think are the challenges to develop those skills across the 5 categories.
Yeah, so I was only recently introduced to them by you, and as I'm reading them, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so familiar, right? It just slightly different language, but often the same words and similar categories. I would say that the real challenges to whether it's the IDGs or it's cultivating a solutionary mindset is that a lot of this does not come naturally to us. And I'll say more about that. I think certain things, like I think compassion is natural to us. I don't think that the cognitive skills, the critical thinking and systems thinking, that does not come naturally to us. We have to work really hard at that. I also think that the community and relationship building outside of our tribe doesn't come naturally to us. We live in a globalized world, but we grew up in bands of small numbers. And that idea of us and them, I don't think we just sort of created it in modern civilization. I think that there's a core nature to that in-group, out-group. And it's I think we have to really struggle to cultivate we rather than us versus them, to cultivate both and thinking as opposed to either or thinking. And so much in our culture steers us away from this. So our media system, our political system, there's so many systems that drive our legal system, drive us into either or. We might have 2 candidates. We can only vote for one of them. And then when they're passing legislation, it's yay or nay or abstain, right? There's this way this is cultivated all of the time. And we have to resist it. And it's not easy to resist. I mean, so I'll tell you another story. I was driving my car, it's 2009, and I'm listening to the radio, and there's an announcement about an upcoming debate at New York University. And the debate topic is whether or not the US is responsible for Mexico's drug wars. And I remember hearing that and just think, I was more perplexed than anything else. And that's a very, very specific question. And I thought, why that question? They're going to be bringing in experts who are going to argue one side or the other of this with an audience that's then going to vote on who won about this very specific question about the culpability for Mexico's drug wars. Meanwhile, the drug wars raging and the underlying causes, the economic causes, the lack of education, the inequities, that the violence, the impacts of drug use, that problem, like overdose deaths and all the impact of drug use, like, wouldn't it make sense to have experts coming in to address any one of those problems and talk about how we could solve that problem? And it just seems so misguided. But at least in the United States, debate is like part of high school. My son went to a school where he had to participate in a debate in order to graduate, but he didn't have to participate in teamwork to solve a problem in the community. Like, it just is so off. So this is why it's hard. It's hard because we don't learn this in our childhood. We don't learn this in school. We don't learn this from our media. We learn instead to take sides. We learn instead to be focused on who's us and who's them. And well, in this moment, what I feel more than anything is that it's terribly sad because we have the potential to solve our problems. We have the potential to collaborate. We have the potential to bridge divides. And the solutionary approach is a really effective way to get there.
Mm-hmm. I'm moved by everything that you just said. And what I'm noticing in the conversation, for those of you who are listening by audio, maybe you are hearing it in Zoe's voice, but I certainly see it on the screen. There's this illumination about you. It's very contagious, which is why I thought you'd be a great guest to talk about optimism. So I've got these like little inner development goal IDG cards describing all 23 of them. And where optimism sits in is in the 5th category around acting. And I'm just going to read out what the IDG framework has to say about optimism, which is the ability to sustain and communicate a sense of hope, positive attitude, and confidence in the possibility of meaningful change. And I just feel like everything you talk about is situated in that hope. Now, you're not an expert researcher on the topic of optimism, but you seem to live it, you embody it. So I want to ask at a personal level, what you do to cultivate your degree of optimism. Does it come naturally or is it something you work at, and how do you do it? And then also how you in your curriculum or your programming also develop optimism, because it feels like it's an important skill to have. I don't even know if you'd call it a skill, but it would be it's a mindset.
It is a mindset. It's interesting because I started this book and my last book, The World Becomes What We Teach, with the opening sentence, "A better world is possible." I've started 2 books that way. That is an optimistic statement. I think that by nature, I tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic. I'm married to somebody who's quite pessimistic. And so I do think it's my nature. But it's not Pollyanna-ish optimism. It's not this sort of just rosy, I'm hopeful kind of attitude. I like to talk about evidence-based optimism. So I actually work really hard to cultivate my optimism, particularly these days, because there's a lot to not be optimistic about. And so how do I cultivate it? Well, in this book, I talk about how much has changed in my lifetime. So I'm 63 years old. I was born in 1961. And so much has changed in my lifetime. So when I was born, half of all people on Earth lived in extreme poverty. Now that's fewer than 10%. Still crazy high. I mean, we're talking about, 700 million people, but proportionately vastly fewer than when I was born. When I was born, only about half of the people in the world had access to electricity. Now it's around 90%. That's a huge change. When I was born, in many states in the US, Black and white people couldn't get married. And when I was 3 years old, the Civil Rights Act was passed. The Supreme Court declared anti-miscegenation laws unconstitutional. That happened in my lifetime. I grew up in New York City. Smog and soot coated New York and many, many other cities. The air is actually cleaner, the wildfires notwithstanding, than when I was a kid. Same with the waterways. Despite all of the water pollution, it's so horrific. We don't have lakes and rivers catching on fire the way we did when I was a kid. Gay rights wasn't on the radar when I was a kid. Girls, who were born when I was born, in those early years, they did not aspire to have the careers that you and I have, right? The options were nurse and teacher and flight attendant, stewardess back then. So now more girls go to college in the US than boys. And around the world, most girls are able to go to school. And in terms of animal rights issues, that was not on the radar at all. And now most people think that animals should be treated humanely. So we see that a lot has changed for the better. Now, we're also seeing hard-won rights being rolled back, and a lot of what I see is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We are not where we were when I was born. And I have to remind myself of that over and over and over again, because that's where my evidence-based optimism lies. It's seeing that positive changes can happen. So I write about that because I want people to realize that, if we look throughout history, there's so much that we have to acknowledge has changed for the better. I think, it's ironic that in the United States, there's a MAGA movement that says, "Make America Great Again," as if America was great when women didn't have these rights, when gay and lesbian people and trans people didn't have the rights they have, when we had Jim Crow. Like, make America great again? How about make America better? Right? Make the world better. It's just very intriguing to me. So with all of that said, there are a couple of quotes there's one quote about hope that I love so much. It's by Professor David Orr, and he says, "Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up." So how do I stay hopeful? I just keep rolling up my sleeves. And if I don't roll up my sleeves and get to work and find other people who are wonderful and solutionary focused and want to do this work too, it's easy to fall into some despair, right? If you're not seeing positive changes that you are part of, it's easy to lose that hope. And with all that said, I will say that I am not always hopeful. I am not always optimistic. And one doesn't have to always be hopeful and optimistic. Those are emotions. Emotions come and go and change all the time. It is not a prerequisite to aspire to or work to improve things to have hope. It's just not. To me, what's more important is that when I look in the mirror, I can have respect for the person who looks back at me than whether I have hope on any particular day. And so I don't let occasional despair or despondency or lack of hope stand in the way of rolling up my sleeves. And I know from experience that hope will return.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. We mentioned earlier that, the IDG framework and the Solutionary Way overlap in so many places. So if the language is similar or exact, let's not get, tripped up by semantics. I wonder whether or not there's anything in the Solutionary Way that you personally have struggled with as a skill to develop, and one that has had particular stickiness where you're like, this greases the wheel?
That's a good question. I don't, the thinking skills, I think critical thinking is something that I love to cultivate, and systems thinking, critical and systems thinking. Knowing what is the best strategy, figuring out what is the best strategy, and being creative about that. I often rely on other people to help with that, for those ideas. And the beauty of the solutionary approach is that it demands collaboration. I shouldn't say demand. Somebody can be a solutionary all by themselves. Some very introverted person who never wants to collaborate, they can still be solutionary. But for most of us, it's the collaboration that helps. And so what you ask is a really good question, because if we can identify that, then we can find the right collaborators, people where we're really meshing beautifully and complementing one another. I would also say that thinking quickly, having new ideas, that comes really naturally to me. Doing the methodical work of laying the foundation and groundwork, less so. So fortunately, at the Institute for Humane Education, we have the most amazing team. And there are other people who are like, this is only going to work in K-12 schools if we do this and we do it this way and we scaffold it. I'm like, go. And that's why it's going, because we have Julie Meltzer at the head of our team, who is just making this unfold, because she is so masterful at seeing the process of what people need to get there, where my skill is like seeing where we want to go and just I boomerang, and she's like, well, we can't boomerang, we got to do this. So thank you for asking that question. It's a really good one for me to ponder.
And I think the reason why I asked it is that I see the IDG framework with 23 skills to develop as 23 invitations for people to get curious about how they want to improve an aspect of their life. They want to develop a skill. And that once they've kind of looked at one, maybe they'll look at some others, right? So it's an entryway across multiple dimensions. And I found it because empathy is on the framework. Empathy and compassion is in the relating framework. And what I've discovered is that I don't do enough of the presence skills, the being, the inner compass, the self-awareness, having presence, right? So I think the underlying question or conversation is that everybody who is working in the space of change, everybody who wants to be a solutionary, has some skills that they naturally bring, some gifts that they naturally bring, some things that come easy, and other things that have to be developed. And if it doesn't get developed by you because there's not enough hours in the day, then it means collaborating with somebody who has that strength. That's what I'm taking away from this conversation. And I think that alone, just the idea of having self-awareness about what our capacities are, where our limits are, where we can draw strengths from one another and find, synergies, is a really important set of skills to have as a whole.
Yes. And I would say that being piece in the IDGs, everybody still has to focus on that. Everybody has to cultivate that. Because if you're too off balance with that set of skills, you may not be successful at even being able to collaborate. The relational skills that you need, you do still have to work on that self-awareness, that introspection, that authenticity and integrity piece. So I think everybody has to cultivate that. Some people are going to be better than others, but everybody has to cultivate that. And then the rest, I do think, can be very synergistic. But I wouldn't want anybody to be looking at the IDGs and think they could bypass being.
Yeah. And that's the bingo for me, is like, how can I have a book on empathy if I'm not actually really legitimately practicing all of that stuff? Right. Yeah. So it is, please hold up your book one more time for those who can see, The Solutionary Way. My last question, as always, when we say goodbye, is if you can think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
So, it's interesting because the person who I'm going to describe just this morning posted on a picture of himself with my book on social media, on Facebook, saying, I'm sitting here reading my dear old friend Zoe Weil's book. And you asked this question, and he's the story I want to tell. And this is from a long time ago. So in 1985, my father died. I was only 23. My dad was only 58. And he had a almost 5-year battle with cancer. And I know some people don't like using that word battle, but he battled that cancer. And it was just a horrible death and a horrible loss. And I was young, and most of my friends, I mean, maybe only one or two had ever had a loss like that. And most of my friends did not know what to say or what to do. And it was really common for people to say, let me know if you need anything. I mean, 2 months after my dad died, one friend said, it's time to get over it and move on. And I literally said that. And this guy, John Urey, the one who just posted his picture with my book, he scheduled with me dinner every single week for a year. We went to the same restaurant every single week for a year. We didn't talk about my dad. He just showed up. And that was such an incredible gift at the worst time in my life, that I had a friend who just showed up every week.
I see him. I'm happy you had him.
Me too. Yeah.
And I'm sorry for your loss so long ago. Can you talk about your dad for a bit?
So my dad was this warm, incredibly friendly, dignified person who loved me so unconditionally. And I felt so loved by him. I mean, everybody loved my dad. And his own life, he kept all the dark things, all the hard things, he didn't talk about them. So his own father died when he was only 12 years old. And then his mom sent him to a boarding school that was really anti-Semitic, and he was Jewish. And they used to play Let's Roll the Jew Boy Down the Hill. I mean, just awful. And he I think, cultivated this dignity and warmth and kindness. And he was also an amazing athlete. So then people wanted him on his team. And then it was World War II, and he was 17 years old, and he enlisted in the Navy. And he was sent, after training, he was sent to get on a ship that was heading toward the North Sea, heading toward Murmansk, Russia, to fight on the European front. And the night before the ship sailed, he was beaten up so badly, again, because he was Jewish. And so he was taken off that ship, and the ship sailed, and that ship was bombed, and everybody on that ship died. So the irony of my Jewish father having his life saved because of anti-Semitism in World War II is just mind-boggling. That is the only story my dad would ever tell me about the war. He was then shipped to the Pacific Front, and he just wouldn't talk about it because it was just such a terrible, traumatic thing. And he was a boy. He was 17, and he wouldn't talk about it. Just like when he had cancer, he wouldn't talk about it. I don't know that was healthy, that he stuffed all that down, but he learned to cope with dark, painful things by just bringing his best, loving self to the world.
He sounds amazing.
He was pretty amazing.
And so are you.
What?
And so are you.
Oh, thank you, Anita. I feel like I have my dad as a role model, that even though it was such a short period of my longer life, 23 years, I get to carry that love that he gave me forever.
Beautiful. And that is why I love asking these questions. The author of The Solutionary Way, Zoe Weil, thank you once again for joining us on this podcast. We'll see everyone and hear from everyone. Or thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
Thank you, Anita.
If you know someone who'd benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Post the link on your socials and hit the subscribe button now. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.